And the idea is to do a bit of a send-up of modern campaign craft in the context of U.S. elections. The setting that I envision is one where we're talking about the home stretch of an American election campaign. So probably not about now, not in real time now, but sometime in September or October, after which it is too late to build a coalition. It's too late to fundraise to any appreciable degree. At this late date, the strategies have been set. You already have your presidential tickets, your vice presidential running mates. The economy is what it is. Foreign wars have done what they're going to do. And now you have to focus in on close-in campaign tactics. And so the question for you as a budding campaign strategist is, how will you allocate your resources? This is a rather important consideration because the resources in these campaigns are considerable. It's expected that multiple billions of dollars will be spent on the campaigns, and because of the strangeness of American campaign finance laws, the campaigns themselves, the Obama and Romney campaigns themselves, will not be the only ones spending money. In contrast to many other policies where campaign money is centralized and spent only through parties, in the United States, much of the money that will be spent on the ground, probably over $1 billion, will be spent by nominally allied and disjoint organizations. So they're allied with the campaigns, but they're, strictly speaking, from a legal fiction standpoint, independent. So they don't coordinate with the campaign. So whether you're working for a coordinated campaign or the actual campaign, the question is really about targeting. How will you figure out whom to contact and how will you communicate with them? Remember that in the American context, not in the Australian context, mobilization is an enormously important aspect of campaign strategy and tactics. Recall that in the United States, we have the second lowest voter turnout of any Western democracy, saved only from the cellar position by Switzerland. On the other hand, American voter turnout has recently surged a bit. And so one of the interesting features of American voter turnout is that in 2000, which was an unbelievably close election, decided by only 538 votes, you had relatively low turnout. I mean, by contemporary standards, it was fairly low. Only 107 million people voted, whereas in 2004, that number surged to 124 million. By 2008, it was 133 million. So in a very short period of time, something changed. Partly what changed was the focus of the campaigns on voter mobilization as opposed to persuasion. On the other hand, it's an open question as to whether or not in any given campaign you're going to go for one or the other. In the case of mobilization, you're trying to put another vote onto your heap of votes. You're taking a non-voter and putting them onto your stack of votes. In the case of persuasion, you're in some sense doubly advantaged because you're taking a vote off of your opponent's heap of votes and putting it onto yours. And so, in principle, persuasion is a more effective strategy, but in practice, it's very difficult to get people to change their minds. Even now, months before the election of November 6th, you have only a relatively small slice of the American public saying that they're undecided as between President Obama or Governor Romney. Now, one of the interesting things about these different strategies, and just broad strategies, is that they have different technical requirements. Mobilization requires a certain amount of technology. You have to have some sense of who the voters are, because the last thing you want to do if you're running a mobilization campaign is to mobilize your opponents, people who are, staunchly opposed to your candidate. If you get them to vote when they otherwise would have stayed home, you'll make yourself worse off. And so much of what passes for so-called micro-targeting, and I'll say more about that in a minute, is the use of public information as well as consumer databases to figure out the likely preferences of the voting public. So one approach is, of course, to do this by brute force, by literally identifying the preferences of every voter by doing a bunch of polls or whatnot. But another is to use the magic of micro-targeting. And so I'll say quite a bit about that in a minute, describing what people mean by micro-targeting. On the other hand, persuasion also requires some prior information because it pays to persuade the people who are going to show up to the polls. And it's really hard to understand American politics without understanding this little fact. because young people, for example, have notoriously lower voter turnout rates than older people, younger people are less likely to be targeted by the political parties. Why? Because a party doesn't want to spend a lot of money persuading you, only to have you stay at home. And that accounts for one of the other important facts about American politics, that the issues that are discussed and the places where the discussion occurs are disproportionately tilted toward elderly voters. Why is it that Medicare and Social Security are continually the focus of presidential campaign conversations? Of course, they're important topics in their own right for people of any age, but they are of special importance to one of the largest voting blocks, people who are beyond the usual retirement age of 65 or 70. So older Americans voted disproportionately high rates, younger Americans voted disproportionately low rates, and that accounts for the tilt in the way in which campaigns are pitched. That also goes, interestingly enough, in the context of the United States for socioeconomic status. Poor people tend to vote at much lower rates in the United States than wealthy people. And the same go for people with lower levels of education as opposed to higher. It's also true for minorities. They tend to vote at lower rates as opposed to higher rates for Anglo-Americans. And so the idea then is that the socioeconomic differences exacerbate the party targeting strategies because parties want to go where the votes are. So then let's say a bit about how it is that the parties find out whom to target. How do they know? One of the things that's a little bit surprising to people who don't know very much about the United States is how many open public records there are about Americans. Not quite as many as in Sweden or Denmark, but a remarkably copious amount of data are available about Americans, and in particular this comes from the so-called voter registration file. When you register to vote in the United States, your information is a matter of public record. And so, for example, it will have your birth date, which of course tells somebody who's trying to target you your age, which tells them something about your likelihood of voting. Right? It will include your last name, which can be run against a database of ethnic surnames, so they'll have some guess about your ethnicity. It'll say something about your gender, also a relevant factor because of the partisan tilt that causes women to favor the Democrats and men to favor the Republicans. There are also other pieces of critical information in the voter file, like your address, because your address can be mapped to a census database, which includes income and affluence. Your socioeconomic status can be inferred from your address. Moreover, knowing your name and your address allows microtargeters to link your political profile to consumer databases. So we can find out what cars you drive or what magazines you subscribe to. And of course, when the mass media writes about this, they just love this aspect of microtargeting. This really captures their imagination that Democrats in their view are Volvo driving vegetarians and Republicans are NASCAR watching gun toting pariahs. And so the idea is there's a lot of lore about what microtargeting actually does. And we'll say a little bit more about the reality of it. But that's the idea, that you're going to take a database and you're going to use the information in that database to draw inferences about a person's likely political. So this is a little bit small, I think, for you to read. But so one of the things I just absolutely love doing is trawling around the internet and finding the claims of what these campaign services are going to provide for you, the campaign consultant or the ambitious political candidate. In the United States, campaign activities are totally unregulated. And so there is no regulatory agency that checks up to see whether the claims that you are making are in fact true. So one of the ways in which this is manifest is in campaign services. There's a huge industry in the United States in campaign services, the biggest in the world, not just because the United States has such a big economy, but because we also have the most frequent elections in the world. We have more frequent elections than any other country. We vote more in a single year than many people in other countries will vote in a decade, because we have a very disaggregated electoral calendar. Federal, state, local, sometimes county is separate from those. Sometimes there'll be multiple elections at a given level in a year, as well as party primary elections. So it's a very busy thing, and that of course is like a big public works program for campaign consultants. So what is it they want to tell you about? Well, they'd like to sell you really expensive campaign services, and one of them is microtargeting. And it's kind of fun to read their characterizations of what they're doing. This one, for example, is all about how microtargeting is done by their firm. And when I say microtargeting, I mean something that is a service that will roughly cost about $100,000 per campaign. So it's a serious piece of change. What are they going to do? They're going to do a poll. They're going to do a survey of people in a given state. For example, this one talks about Colorado. They say, for example, in Colorado, 500 interviews are acceptable, but we did 3,000 interviews. Okay, so 3,000 interviews is what they're going to do. They're going to draw a random sample of people off the voter file and interview them. And then they're going to get their responses to a whole bunch of opinion questions, especially opinions with respect to political parties. Then, for those of you who've taken any statistics, they are going to do a multivariate regression analysis. They're just going to do a simple regression analysis. These people are not geniuses. They're just going to do a regression analysis which is going to use the information on the voter file, which is available for everybody, as predictors of the answers in their poll for the 3,000 people in their study. Then they're going to use those same coefficients that they get from their regression to generate forecasts for everybody else in Colorado. And that's something they're going to sell you for $100,000. And you know, to do 3,000 interviews, you know, roughly $20 an interview, you know, maybe a little bit of staff cost. Well, they're already making a profit if they can sell that microtargeting list once, but if they can sell it multiple times, it's a very, very profitable enterprise. So what's fun is to look carefully at the text of these things to see what they're claiming on behalf of this microtargeting firm. So this is a Republican microtargeting firm. I actually have a student of mine working there now. It's interesting that, you know, they're trying to drum up business from Republican candidates, and so they're going to tell a lurid anecdote about how powerful their for sale technology is. So they say microtargeting is not like rudimentary segmentation schemes developed decades ago. Not like that. It's not lumping millions of households together based solely on their zip code or age or magazine preferences. No, no, no. Microtargeting uses all of the data and much, much more. More than all. I'm not sure how much more that is, but that's what it sounds good. So then they tell you about an anecdote, and the anecdote is, it happens in 2004. A person runs a perfect campaign, because of course they're buttering this person up, running for Senate. They run a perfect campaign, but they come 524 votes short. So now their firm is charged with the task of finding these votes. And so they sell this very expensive technology, microtargeting technology, so they can target low turnout Republicans, Republican voters who were defecting Democrats, et cetera, et cetera. And then, lo and behold, when the story concludes, they find 10,000 additional votes. 10,000 additional votes. That is remarkable. But of course, when you're thinking about this with any kind of level of scientific critical faculty, you know, you think to yourself, what is the control group, okay? Whenever you hear somebody give an anecdote about how they did something and something happened, you think, well, that's one of the most basic, inferential, or kind of dopey errors you can make. You want to know what would have happened in the absence of this fancy microtargeting technology. Would the tides of political fortune have generated 10,000 votes anyway? What did they contribute? You can't really tell that from reading their anecdote. One interesting thing, though, that you can tell, is you can ask, how accurate are these microtargeting scores? After all, they're selling them to you for $100,000. You hope you get something good. Well, I was working with working as an egghead academic. I was studying a governor campaign in 2006. Actually, there literally is a book, I'm not making this up, called Rick Perry and His Eggheads, and I'm egghead number one. And so the book is all about how, you know, we're bringing a little bit, a modicum of science to the study of campaign craft. So here's a case where you take the microtargeting scores that are on this axis, okay, and the outcome of the poll that we did to assess support for the governor. So the governor is a Republican, and our microtargeting scores should predict a very high level of Republican support on the people who score with pro-GOP microtargeting scores, as opposed to pro-Democratic people. But you can see that the the pro-Republicans go for the Republican candidate at a 60% rate, as opposed to the pro-Democrats who go for the Republican at a 39% rate. Well, that's not very good. I mean, it's not nothing, but you wouldn't pay $100,000 for that. That's only ho-hum performance, especially since you yourself can use the voter file to figure out more or less who will vote in this way based on your own, homespun regression. And so the point that I'm making is not that you wouldn't want to do microtargeting, you would. It's only that you can make outlandish and very profitable claims in the context of the United States and only do a so-so job. It goes not only for microtargeting, it goes for the actual campaign tactics themselves. So, for example, one of the very popular tactics in the United States is to use pre-recorded or so-called robocalls to persuade or mobilize voters. I'm not sure whether they're used here, but they're the bane of everyone's existence in the United States because you're getting all these pre-recorded calls. And every campaign has its lurid story about the magical robocall and put them on the top. They usually cost about 3 cents per completed call. So you can do a whole heap and helping of robocalls at very little money. And what's funny is to read the testimonials about this. We had Dick Van Dyke record our message. Now, Dick Van Dyke was like a B-level actor. I think he was in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And so we had Dick Van Dyke record our message to Malibu voters, and here's the evidence. A referendum that was expecting a close vote and less than 40% turnout had record turnout, and we won with 58% of the vote. Proof positive. No further question to that. So it turns out we have done a series of randomized experiments assessing the effects of robocall. I think we've done 11. I think they've involved more than 1 million people, and I'll describe what I mean by randomized trial. But I think it has a perfect record of never having worked. With one exception, actually, one exception, but it's a totally different kind of thing. At any rate, it's kind of interesting to ask, what would count as good evidence? Well, unfortunately, what many of my colleagues do in academics does not count as good evidence, and you should probably be forewarned of that before you hear them talk about campaigns. So I'm going to poison your minds early before you even get into their classes. But that said, you should always look at this kind of evidence with a very critical eye. So what's the most common way of studying the effectiveness of campaign tactics? The answer is to do a survey. So you do a survey and you ask people, did someone from the parties call you up or encourage you to vote in a particular way? And you're tempted the voting probabilities of the people who said they were contacted to the people who said they were not contacted. Okay, it seems like a very simple thing. Like, okay, so you were contacted by Romney and you weren't contacted by Romney. How much more likely are you to vote for Romney as a result of having been contacted? But there are 3 problems. The first is that campaigns didn't single you out for that phone call at random. They probably called you precisely because they had some inkling about how you would vote. Right? So even if the calls had no effect whatsoever, you would see a relationship. You'd see a correlation between who received that call and how they were likely to vote. Okay, so again, without a control group, you have to deal with the so-called selection problem or strategic targeting problem. That these groups are not comparable, those who were contacted and those who were not. The second is that even if they were comparable, in the context of surveys, people don't tell you, well, if I say they don't tell you the truth, it sounds like they're lying. But suffice to say that they're not telling you, giving you an accurate representation of what actually happened. Okay? So the problem, in a way, is that many people think of themselves as the sort of people who would be contacted by a campaign. And so they're asked, did someone from the Romney campaign call you up or encourage you to vote? You think to yourself, yeah, I'm the sort of person they would call. Yes, I say yes. And it may have not happened. And there are some really quite elegant experiments where they randomly present people with different kinds of campaign ads or different kinds of pieces of direct mail, and then they call people up to see whether they received them, and you know that the control group didn't receive them because they weren't sent them, and still people will say, yes, I received them. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is that the questions themselves are vague. What we want to know is whether a specific phone call had an effect. But if we look closely at many of the survey questions, elections, they are framed in the most vague possible way, without reference to time, place, or man. And so it's very difficult to imagine, even under ideal circumstances, that you get something meaningful. So what's the answer to that? What's better than that? In the last decade or so, a little bit more, there has been the advent of a new style of political science, and indeed a new style of social science more generally. This is sometimes lumped under the heading of the credibility revolution in social science. In economics, people talk about taking the con out of econometrics. And essentially the movement is toward much more defensible forms of evidence than the kinds of survey-based correlations that I showed in the last slide. So what's going on there? Well, I think that people have grown a little bit tired of the tendency among social scientists to say any damn thing they want with numbers. And instead, they want to hold social scientists to a higher standard, where they say, look, I want you to show me that your method for getting answers about cause and effect is unbiased, in the sense that there's no tendency for you to produce an effect if there weren't an effect. There's nothing about the treatment group that's going to be ahead of the control group. And so the idea then of a randomized trial or an experiment is to randomly assign people to receive some kind of campaign communication or not. And because they're randomly assigned, there's no tendency for the people who receive it, vis-a-vis the people who don't receive it, to be more likely to be pro-Obama, pro-Romney, more likely to vote, less likely to vote. They're identical in expectation. And so that's the idea. So an experiment here is used in the technical sense of a study in which the units of analysis are assigned at random to treatment and control. That's what we mean by an experiment. I realize that when people use the word experiment in common parlance, they will use it to mean tinker, I'm experimenting with something, I'm experimenting with my new hairdo, but they don't really need a randomized experiment. Here we need something that's termed a randomized experiment. And so the front end of this is the random assignment of the treatment. And then the back end of this is to use public records to measure outcomes. It's not because surveys are out of bounds or inherently unreliable. It's that you want to make sure that there's no connection in the mind of the respondent between the intervention that you randomly deployed and their expression about the outcome. So if people think that they're being targeted for an experiment by the Romney campaign, and that somebody from the Romney campaign is calling them up to ask them, what their opinions are, they might be more likely to say, I'm going to vote for Romney. Okay? But that's not how they're actually going to vote. And what you care about as a scientist is how they actually are going to vote, or actually did vote. And so for that reason, you tend to use public records. In the United States, and in a few other countries, the UK, for example, and France and Brazil, you can find out who voted individually. In other words, I can look you up, and you can look me up, actually. I don't think I get anything if I look you up. But you can look me up, and you can see, Green didn't vote in this last primary. What's up with it? And that's public record for pretty much any American. Even if you couldn't get individual level turnout, you could get precinct level vote outcomes in terms of both the number of votes cast and who the people in the precinct voted for. And so that's enormously useful if you wanted to randomly assign different precincts to receive different kinds of communications. So you use different direct mail or phone calls or door-to-door visits or radio commercials or whatever, and you want to consult precinct level outcomes to see whether that moves people. But the idea is you're going to hold yourself to a higher standard. So you might say, well, all right, what do you find when you do these experiments? Well, it turns out there have been a lot of these experiments, and they've not only been done in the United States, but they've been done in a variety of countries. China, Benin, India, Pakistan, what goes on, Mexico. And it's kind of fun to just give you the quick summary of the results. I wrote a book called Get Out the Vote, How to Increase Voter Turnout, which obviously isn't selling well in Australia. But what's fun about it is, in the Ivy League, they sometimes make a joke about the distinction between books you've read and books you've read yourself. So this is so this could be a book you've read. So I'll give you the summary. So the idea is, if you talk to a campaign consultant who's selling services, right, and is making a profit per service he or she is selling you. So they might own a direct mail firm, printing house, or they might own a phone bank, okay? And you say, what should I do? Very often, the thing that will be recommended, and I'm not making this up, is a package of things that are supposedly suffused with synergy. Okay, synergy is one of the big words. And the idea is, well, first we start the conversation with 3 pieces of direct mail. Okay, a piece of direct mail costs roughly 50 cents to print, another 30-something cents to mail. Okay, so that's a piece of change. Okay, then we follow up with a phone call or two, maybe even a robotic phone call. Then we might follow up with some more mail. Then we might follow up with a door-to-door visit. Finally, we'll finish the conversation with a final piece of mail and a final robocall. Okay, that's a package, and believe me, that's a minimalist package because some of these people are getting 50 or 60 pieces of mail. Okay, so one of the things you should kind of keep in your head is what I call the dollar bill test, the trail of dollar bills test. So sometimes when you calculate based on these randomized experiments how many dollars you're spending to generate one vote, it's a number like $150 a vote, or $80 a vote, and you think, well, if I just left a trail of dollar bills to the polling place, I would probably be doing better than I am doing it. Of course, then the campaign consultant wouldn't get the dollar bills. But the idea is that should certainly be the standard. It turns out there's almost no evidence for synergy. If anything, the evidence works in the opposite direction, that you see market evidence of diminishing returns. So that once you've hit somebody with the 3 pieces of mail, if you were to randomly assign what comes next, whether they get it or not, it would be less effective than if they had not gotten the initial 3 pieces. So what are some illustrative examples? Well, Acorn, a kind of left-of-center interest group that went defunct when it was the object of kind of expose that nobody even knows is true, whether it's true. On Fox News, Fox News upended Acorn and went out of business. But basically, Acorn was this group that used to mobilize poor people in a lot of local and national elections. But in this local election, they were trying to save a hospital from closing in Maricopa County, in the Phoenix area in Arizona. And they focused on Latino voters. These are registered voters who have Latino surnames. And this is a local election. And so the idea was they wanted to get these people to vote to save the hospital. So they did a mobilization campaign. And we randomly assigned whether people were targeted or not. And what's interesting about this is that you see a profound surge in turnout among the people who were targeted. That's door to door. What about phone banks? This is the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. So again, Latinos. And phone banking was reasonably effective. It's not as effective as door-to-door canvassing, but these were sort of authentic volunteer phone banks, and so you'd have a conversation with people. These were bilingual callers, so they could talk to people regardless of their native language. And that also tends to work reasonably well. So if door-to-door canvassing raises turnout by roughly 7-8 percentage points, this kind of volunteer phone banking usually raises it by 3 to 5 percentage points. What about the robocall from a famous Univision anchorwoman, television celebrity? Nothing, not a darn thing. And this one involves hundreds of thousands of people. Similarly, no effect of having your local Catholic clergy calling. And what's interesting about this one is this is a big experiment again with Naleo, where a huge amount of money was spent using focus groups. So many of you will go on to lucrative careers in the world of mass media, and some of you may even be running focus groups. So you've heard it here first. The basic idea is you get this group of people, in this case Latinos, and you show them different pieces of direct mail that you might be sending, and you get them to comment on whether they think the mail is good looking, whether they think the mail is persuasive, whether they would vote if they got the mail. And what you tend to get is something that's totally useless. Because what you want to know is whether they will actually vote as a result of the mail, not whether they say they will vote as a result of the mail. Right? Those are 2 very different things. Because as long as we're in the kind of conversation where you're presenting yourself as the concerned citizen, and I'm the stenographer writing down everything you say, you might say all kinds of of things that might seem to you socially desirable. So, for example, people in this focus group said, we do not want to see pictures of Jennifer Lopez. We don't want to see any celebrities. All right, that would have made the mail eye-catching, but they don't want to see it. Okay, so we don't know whether Jennifer Lopez would have generated more votes than the bland people who were on the mailing, but the people on the mailing had no effect. Okay, and the focus groups cost as much as the mailing itself. It was an extremely expensive thing. It's roughly $5,000 per focus group that you convene. Okay, so it's a hugely expensive thing. Remember, you know, these postcards are roughly 50 cents a piece, so every time you have a focus group, that's a lot of mail you're not sending. Anyway, it doesn't matter whether they sent this mail because it didn't do anything at all. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't know whether it does anything at all because you don't do an experiment. But here we randomly assigned this mail and found that it had no effect on voter turnout at all. And this was nonpartisan mail designed to mobilize low voter turnout Latino. Turns out there have been a lot of studies, and so many studies that you can actually pool them together. And here's a case of something called meta-analysis, which is a technique for pooling lots of experiments together and kind of summarizing them into one giant experiment. And you can see that the average effect over dozens of canvassing studies is roughly a 7 percentage point increase. So you might say, okay, well, that's all well and good, but the question is, you know, don't we already know this stuff? Don't we already know that, you know, that voter turnout increases when you knock on people's doors? It's so obvious, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I think that what's kind of interesting about this is, well, people may know it, but they also know a lot of things that seem to be false. For example, it's kind of a conventional wisdom in American politics that people who vote by mail vote at extremely high rates. So people who who register to be a permanent absentee voter, vote at rates of like 80 or 90%. So the campaign consultant says, oh great, how can I make someone into a permanent absentee voter, right? But of course, it's like joining the basketball team because you want to be taller. It's not going to make you taller, it's just that there are a lot of tall people on the team. So in much the same way, when you do a randomized experiment, and you randomly encourage people to vote by mail, there doesn't seem to be much of an effect. So you encourage people to vote by mail, but it doesn't make them more likely to vote, it just makes them more likely to vote by mail. So that's kind of interesting. Another interesting finding with respect to this kind of new science of randomized trials and campaign craft is that sometimes the campaign consultants get it exactly backward. In the case of persuasion experiments, that seems to be you know, not as uncommon as you might think. So here's a study, a very, very large-scale study involving tens of thousands of people, where an abortion rights group targeted women who had earlier been micro-targeted as being sympathetic to abortion rights, reproductive rights. Okay? So that sounds good, except these were Republican women. Because the idea was, this is a gubernatorial race where you'd like to reach across the aisle. It's ordinarily a Democratic issue. You like to reach over to Republicans whom you believe are sympathetic to your candidate on this issue. So you send people out door to door, and you say, you know, here's what my preferred candidate says about your issue, abortion, and it backfires. It actually makes them less likely to vote for your candidate. And it's a reminder, actually, of how complex political communication is, because two things are going on. On the one hand, you're disseminating policy-related campaign information, but on the other hand, you know, you're showing up at their doorstep looking like a Democrat. Right? They're saying, you know, you're wearing Birkenstocks, what's the deal? Very gray, whatever. And you know, you look like exactly the person I envision as my ideological enemy. And so that, not that I've proven this or anybody else has proven this, but it's an interesting reason why campaign communication can backfire, because it's not just about the communication on the page, but perhaps also about the nonverbal communication. And another interesting finding is, if you talk to campaign consultants, they almost all think that the swing voters, the persuadable voters, are all in the middle of the ideological spectrum. But when people have done randomized experiments designed to persuade people, they do not find that the people in the middle of the ideological spectrum move the most as a result of receiving mail. In part because there are multiple reasons why they would be in the middle, like they're just not very attentive to the communications they receive. Could be all kinds of reasons. So what about innovation? What about innovation? You know, because as much fun as it is to lambast the misguided practices of campaign consultants. And the question for academics is, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, you know, can you think of things that we aren't doing but could be doing? And I think that there are a number of ways to answer that question. One of them is to pull out a play from the historical playbook of the United States. The United States used to have very high voter turnout in the 19th century. Very high turnout, roughly 80–90% turnout. And so one of the interesting questions then for political scientists is, you know, why was turnout so much higher then? After all, people were a lot poorer, education was a lot lower, it was a lot harder to vote. It often took a lot of time to get to the polls, and people didn't have cars in those days. And one possible answer, there are multiple, is that, you know, remember that in the 19th century, it was a men-only affair. After the Jacksonian era, there was no property qualification, but it was a men-only affair. And voting was public. So you would walk up onto a platform, whiskey was flowing freely all day long. You'd walk up to the platform, you would get a colored ballot. You could mark in the ballot, or you could just leave it as, you know, kind of pre-filled out. Your party boss would give you the ballot. And then you put it on the ballot box to the jeers and cheers of people around you. And if nobody challenged your right to vote, you put it in. Okay, and that was what voting was. And so, you know, the question was, how much of voting then was about the kind of festive, whiskey drinking atmosphere of the 19th century? One of the interesting things, for example, about 19th century voting, for example, in the 1860s, is that, you know, a large number of polling places were in saloons. For example, in New York City, my hometown, 90% of the polling places were in saloons. And if you think, well, why didn't Victorian women get the right to vote? A lot of it was because people associated with, you know, voting with saloons, and that wasn't what a Victorian woman should be doing. And it's really quite interesting to think of what, you know, how different voting would have been in the era before the progressive reforms of the 1880s and 90s. So we tried to do some experiments, trying to create a modern equivalent of election day festival. No whiskey. These were professorial parties, I'm afraid. But we had free food and drink, basically, and some music, but it was all family-friendly music. So it was not particularly good music. At any rate, the idea was to see if you could recreate some of the attractions, some of the social side benefits of having a festival. The answer is, yeah, you see a little bump in turnout. But I'm sure that others could do those parties much better than we could. And the question, in some sense, is, can you rekindle some of the interesting 19th century magic? I'm going to skip ahead because we're running a little bit behind. I think another thing that political scientists have innovated is more social psychologically sophisticated modes of outreach. So the idea here is to use some principles of social psychology, one being commitment and you know, the desire to kind of maintain your self-conception as a voter. So in this experiment, people were called up and asked whether they intended to vote. And then the people who said yes were randomly assigned to be called a second time. So if you were in the treatment group in this experiment, you were called the day before the election, and you were asked, you know, so you said that last week when we talked, you said that you were going to vote. Tomorrow's election day. Can we count on you to vote? And, you know, this is another opportunity to kind of reinforce their earlier commitment. The effects are really quite profound. This particular one, there were 4 experiments like this. This particular experiment was done with a Pan-Asian phone bank. So there are Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, and Vietnamese Americans. So it's like a 3-ring circus managing that many languages. But the idea is that in each of these cases, with the exception of the Japanese experiment, but that was a very, very small one involving only 76 people, you see big increases in turnout as a result of this second round follow-up phone bank thing, so that they're 13.2 percentage points more likely to vote if they're successfully reached in this way. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is another case of social psychology at work. One of the strongest, some would say, elemental social psychological force is a force associated with what are known as prescriptive social norms. So a descriptive social norm is what you think most people are doing, whereas a prescriptive norm is about what you ought to do. So if you ever watch parents with their children, they're constantly laying out prescriptive norms. You know, don't eat with your mouth full. You know,
put that napkin on your lap, et cetera, okay? And it's all about what you should do. But you could imagine a parent saying, look around the restaurant. Do you notice where the napkins are? It's too subtle for most parents. Like, shut up, put that napkin in. So the idea is that prescriptive norms have special strength. And in this particular experiment, we wanted to test the effects of enforcement of a prescriptive norm about voting being a civic duty. So people in the United States wisely believe that there is a civic obligation to vote, even if they don't necessarily abide by it. And so the question was, to what extent could you increase voter turnout by forcefully asserting that norm, number one. Second, monitoring their compliance with that norm. And third, disclosing whether or not they had successfully complied with the norm. So this is a massive experiment done with 180,000 households. In the control condition, no mail is sent. In the civic duty condition, people are told, do your civic duty and vote. In the Hawthorne condition, it's called Hawthorne because that refers to the famous Hawthorne study where they allegedly showed that bringing a bunch of social scientists in to study factory workers caused the productivity to increase because people knew that they were being watched. Turns out it's not actually true, but it's a good story. But at any rate, in that one, people were told, look, voting is a matter of civic duty, and academics are going to be studying whether you vote or not. In the self condition, voting is a matter of civic duty, voting is a matter of public record. Here's the voting records of you and everybody in your household in the last 2 elections. We're going to check up on you to see whether you voted in this election. And then in the neighbors treatment, it's voting is a matter of civic duty, it's a matter of public record, here's the voting record for you and your housemates, and here's the voting record for 10 of your neighbors, and we're going to be sending your records to them too. And so there's tremendous social pressure to adhere to this norm under the neighbors treatment. And you can see that the effects are really quite large when we get to monitoring and disclosure at the level of the self or the neighbors treatment. That effect in the neighbors treatment is the largest turnout effect that's ever been demonstrated in a large-scale experiment. And it's really quite interesting. And this idea of using these elemental social psychological forces is now all the rage in persuasion and mobilization, not only in the context of politics, but also in marketing. All right, so you say, well, not sure I'm going to be able to do a randomized experiment in many contexts like presidential ads, although, wait and see, we'll see. There are lots of our experimental goals in the campaigns this time around. More are, suffusing all these organizations with each passing year, because they're, it's like a subversive takeover. But the idea is, in the United States, we actually have what might be called quasi-experiments, near experiments, that are occasioned by the fact that our media markets are not coterminous with the boundaries of states. So remember that in the bizarre American electoral system, we have something called the Electoral College. So, with the exception of 2 states, there's a winner-take-all system within every state. If the state is too lopsidedly Democratic or Republican, there's essentially no presidential campaign in that state because there's no hope that the state will flip to the other side, no matter how much campaign goes on. So, for example, California, decidedly Democratic. Texas, decidedly Republican. There's no campaign there. What's interesting, though, about media markets is that if you look at the map of the United States, you look, for example, at Pennsylvania, which is that sort of rectangle up there, you'll see that the Pittsburgh media market blasts into Western Maryland. Now, Western Maryland's Maryland is a blue state. There's no way that a person in Maryland would ordinarily see an ad. But because they're getting the ads that are broadcasted from Pittsburgh, they're seeing a lot of ads, whereas their neighbors a little bit farther to the east are not seeing any ads. And so the question is, if you compared places that were incidentally exposed to ads because they were near a media market in a battleground state, how much higher is their voter turnout than it would be ordinarily? And the answer is no higher at all. This is the map for 2000. I was actually just sent a paper with the maps for 2004 and 2008. Knowing that fact. So it's really quite interesting that you don't see evidence that lots and lots of campaign ads in the United States make people more likely to vote. Now that's kind of interesting because one of the side notes about those ads is that they almost never say the word vote. It's all about attacking the policies or persona of the other guy or pumping up your own. But the word vote is not often mentioned. Rarely mentioned. Okay, so what about persuasion? We know a lot less about persuasion than we do about mobilization. But we did do one randomized experiment, and I'm going to wrap up pretty soon, so I'll tell you about this one, because I think it's very cool. Because the usual knock about against this kind of experimental methodologies, yeah, but you can do it for the low-level things like door knocking or email or direct mail or robocalls or phone banking, maybe radio, but you could never do it for TV because it's just too big and expensive. And so we worked with a campaign for governor, a very, very high-flying campaign for governor, in which they were going to spend tens of millions of dollars, and got them to randomly assign the volume and timing of their television ads in the beginning of the campaign in 2006. So it's not the last experiment, it's not the last word, but it's kind of an interesting experiment insofar as it's the first large-scale experiment done with real live TV media. And in order to gauge outcomes, they were tracking polls with 1,000 respondents every day. So there are 20 media markets in Texas. Texas is like the size of a small country. 20 media markets. And they said, oh, you can't do this experiment in two, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. You can't do those are too valuable politically. But you can experiment in the other 18. So that's what we did. We randomly assigned different timing and levels of ads. And what we found was a relationship. So the amount of gross ratings points that are deployed is a measure of the size of the media buy. So a gross ratings point is allegedly the amount of media that it takes to expose 1% of the population to your ad. So 100 is enough to expose everybody, so to say. And 1,000 is enough to expose everybody 10 times. So that's the argument, 10 times. So in some cases, we're blasting some of these media markets with 1,000 per week. And in other cases, we're blasting them with nothing. And so the idea is, how far does support for the candidate who's doing the advertising move in these surveys as a result of these media buys? And the answer is, for every 1,000 gross rating points you buy, you get about 5 percentage points more vote in the trial. But what's interesting also is that if you look a week later, that effect is gone. So it's really quite an interesting case where you see an effect, but it's ephemeral. Which is quite an interesting commentary on the question of why it is that rational campaigns would spend this kind of money early, knowing that the effect would subside. And the answer is they don't know whether it will subside. They really don't have any information about the effectiveness of their ads at all. As far as I know, in fact, I'm quite confident, this is the only randomized experiment that's been done on campaign ads of this kind. So, when would you expect this kind of these kinds of ads to be persuasive? When would communication be effective? Well, I think one of the conditions is when it's novel information. So one of the interesting features about elections, not only in the United States but everywhere, is that you have a large number of candidates whose names are totally unknown to the electorate. They don't know the first thing about these people. And what's interesting about that is that even a little bit of campaign information that builds up what is known as name recognition can be influential. So we've demonstrated that by simply airing radio ads that mention the names of the candidates, the incumbent and the overmatched challenger. And the prediction is that will help, on average, help the challenger, and that does seem to be the case. So if you have to spend your money, which way would you go? Persuasion or mobilization? I think the reason that these campaigns in the United States have gradually drifted in the direction of mobilization is in part to placate their activists and donors who are more ideologically extreme than the rank-and-file partisans. So I'm not saying that this is the only reason. But another reason, I think, is that mobilization is viewed as a slow and steady but relatively dependable way of generating votes, whereas persuasion is a little more of a crapshoot. And the question is, will they get better at persuasive campaign tactics? It still does account for an overwhelming proportion of the campaign budget, and it is extremely lucrative. If you're looking for a well-paying career, being a media consultant is a good one, because in some cases you get about an 8% cut of what you buy. So you think about, again, Al Checkey, the airline executive, ran for governor in California, spent $66 million of his own money. Lost his campaign consultant got 8% of that, which is, it's like a second home, maybe even a third home, okay? And the guy lost. It's not as though, you go off and you kill the campaign consultant goes on to run other campaigns, okay? And so if you just go from rich person to rich person and run their campaigns and take this cut, you can have a fifth home, a sixth home, you can be in Sydney, you can be in Monaco, you can be all over the place. So it's a lucrative career. So the question in some sense is, well, how can you get the campaign consultants to behave in a manner that's kind of consistent with rigorous science? I think that the campaign consultants that I've met, they're not dishonest. They're not trying to swindle people. They really do believe that what they're doing is good for the candidate, and they really are often passionate partisans themselves. They really want their side to win. But they have conflicting incentives. For example, campaign consultants very often have an incentive to run the same kind of campaign in multiple jurisdictions. So the idea is to have a kind of cookie-cutter operation that can be deployed all over the country. Because there's no guarantee if they do something on the ground in one place that they'll ever be coming back to that place. Okay, so that's why there's a tendency to favor these kinds of impersonal, mass-produced tactics. And you would think that the enduring institutions, the political parties, the unions, foundations, would have an incentive to get the story right. But we have to remember that they're people business. They're people-driven operations, and very often they are populated by campaign consultants who are either operating inside as directors of these institutions or outside as campaign consultants. So it's a little bit of a revolving door. Political science, on the other hand, is only slowly moving toward this more science-oriented campaign craft. It's gradually getting there, and we're now reaching sort of this turning point. Can we study the really big questions using this methodology? Certainly has grown enormously. When I started doing field experiments in 1998, not one field experiment had been published in any political science journal since 1982, which is pretty remarkable. Now they're quite common. But I think the broader point here is the importance of using rigorous scientific methods. What's the kind of broader point here? The broader point here is if you're going to draw causal inferences about cause and effect, what matters? You have to think very hard about comparability. And one of the ways you need to kind of reflect is what would be the implicit experiment that you would do if you wanted to get at the bottom of this causal question? Irrespective of whether you're going to actually do an experiment, you have to ask yourself that question. Simply framing the question in those terms. What is the control group? How would I know if I had a causal effect? That's what's really important. And that, I hope to, if you take nothing else away from today's talk, you take that away. Every time someone makes a claim about what works, ask yourself, what in principle would be the experiment by which I'd adjudicate that question? So you say, well, okay, what kinds of things could be studied with political science? How are you going to study the really, really big questions? Things having to do with topics bigger than campaign craft, to electoral institutions, constitutional forms, that sort of thing. And I'll end with a joke, which is, we have political scientists in office. Political scientists, people with graduate degrees in political science, have often changed world history. Not, unfortunately, in an apparent randomized trial, I'm sad to say. But they have been very determined in intervening in the world in ways that they think will change it. However, there is this one political scientist, relatively unknown compared to, say, Woodrow Wilson or Dick Cheney, Sandy Maisel, whose approach, I think, ought to win more replications, and that is that he ran for office himself, just in order to be able to write about it as a political scientist. And so now we need to field some of our stealth candidates doing randomized experiments along the way, just to see what happens. If you're interested in reading more, you can look at two recent books that I've authored. One is on voter mobilization specifically, and the other is a new textbook just came out on how to do field experiments. And, I welcome your comments and questions, and open them up to the floor. Give it just a little bit. Please.
Throughout your lecture, you said that a lot of the tactics that campaigns use, whilst expensive, don't really work. Why do they use them then?
Well, I think that there are two answers. One is they think that they work. And you would be surprised. I think, actually, what's kind of interesting is that my co-author in a lot of this work, Alan Gerber, is an economist by training. Okay, very, 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 very smart economist. And he went into these experiments thinking, oh, these folks already knew the answer because so much money is on the line. Literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on the line. And he was constantly asking consultants, so where is the evidence on which you're basing these extremely consequential decisions? And the answer is, no, there's really no knowledge base that they can point to. And so they're all sort of shooting from the hip, which raises the question, well, why are they doing that? Why aren't they weeded out if they're running ineffective campaigns? And the answer is because they're not necessarily competing on an effectiveness margin because it's so hard to tell whether your campaign tactics are effective. Right? All you get at the end is a signal, did your candidate win or lose? And very often it's it's a razor-thin victory, but for a few thousand votes, you could have had a different outcome. And yet, whenever there's a victory, the victor always looks like a genius and the loser always looks like a buffoon. And so, given the weak signals here and the infrequency with which they're actually deployed, I think that every campaign consultant can always tell a story about why things didn't go right or why things did go right on their account. And without randomized trials, you just wouldn't be able to tell. So I think the answer is no randomized trials. Yes? It's like the Phil Donahue show.
If there are certain states just always going to side with a particular party, so California is always going to be a Democratic state, then why, can these kind of random field terms work in those particular states because people just expect it to side one way?
I'm going to say a little bit more about what you're asking. You're saying if you basically have one party hegemony over a given area, so the same party always wins, could you still do randomized trials and learn from them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, because one of the interesting things about one-party systems is that they tend to be beset by factionalism. Even within a hegemonic one party, you tend to have different factions that are vying for support, very often, for example, in the context of primary elections or something like that. So this is characteristic for places like Texas, where you have one party that tends to win everything. The real campaigns take place in the party primaries. So I think it just sets the research question back one election. On the other, that's one thing. And the other thing is that even in uncompetitive elections, you can still learn quite a lot about motivation to turn out and the effectiveness of persuasive messages. Because even if it's a foregone conclusion as to which side is going to get more votes, you can still ask, what would my communication do to raise or lower the overall rate? Yes?
This might sound like a simple question, but how do the people running for office and the people who are involved in being elected, how do they sort of come, do they hire these companies that sort of work with them? Or do they have to take sides themselves, like the analysts and the field workers and the political scientists and the analysts? How do they come into that position? Are they independent from the actual party? Or do they, what goes on?
I think there's every possible path, but just judging from the students who come out of my classes over the last 24 years, a lot of them are passionately interested in politics. And so they go off to work for a campaign consulting firm or a survey consulting firm in Washington, D.C. And then the next thing you know, after a little time there, they're working as an assistant director of a campaign, and then maybe they're off directing a campaign 2 years after that, and then maybe they open up their own campaign consulting biz, start running a bunch of campaigns, and that tends to be how it goes. You basically apprentice with some campaign office, and then learn the trade, and then branch out as an independent contractor. So it's not very different in that respect from being a plumber.
Okay, so it's technically
yeah, and there are increasingly now so-called graduate schools of political management, which are essentially master's degrees, where they'll soak you for $20,000 a year to anoint you with some sheepskin that says you are a political consultant. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily better than just learning the trade by the seat of your pants.
And there are certain firms that are more successful and more sought after.
Yeah, absolutely. absolutely. And so it's very similar in a way to you know, to the world of marketing. You know, there are high-flying marketing firms, and you know, you can vie for your position in them, and depending on where you go, you know, you could be you know, kind of a peon in a giant organization, or you could run a relatively small organization yourself. Sure.
So we're actually almost out of time, so I'm going to ask the last question. So building on what's already been asked, we know that these campaign analysts themselves kind of believe in what they're doing, but are there any candidates that you know of at any level who say, well, I've read Gerber and Green and this is just snake oil that they're trying to sell me. I'm actually not going to spend very much on campaign consultants.
Yeah, I've never met a candidate yet. I've tried to tell candidates this, but you know, I think part of it is that, you know, no one ever wants to be the guy who loses by doing something that is not standard operating procedure.
Right.
And so, you know, they raise a lot of money, and they feel badly, they feel beholden to their donors. Like, oh, I have to run a cookie cutter campaign because that's what the donors think they're paying for. And if I didn't do something that was standard operating procedure and lost, the donors would ask for their money back. And so and the consultants feel the same way, which is why I think that it's a little bit like military history in the sense that what will really produce a big sea change will be the campaign that does things very, very differently in advance.
Okay, could you please join me in thanking Professor Green?